to a wicked-looking snake. One or two of the women drew back a little. Nobody seemed very impressed. Pharaoh looked a bit bored, and then he motioned his magicians and sorcerers forward. They stood in a half-circle round Moses and his snake, and they all threw their staffs down, and Moses could hardly believe his eyes. All their staffs turned into snakes. "What on earth happens now?" Moses whispered to Aaron. "I think we're going to be thrown out again," said Aaron. And they were. Oh, Moses was puzzled, but pretty certain that it was not the end of the matter. And he was right. God kept him busy. 3 weeks later, Pharaoh called a board meeting. All the sorcerers and magicians and soothsayers were there. A blast of trumpets, rather shorter than usual, and Pharaoh walked in. He got straight down to business. "As you know," he said, "when this Moses first came to me about freeing the Jews, I threw him out and made his beloved Jews work harder. Then he did that walking stick into snake thing, and you all did the same, and I threw him out again. And then he turned all the water into blood, and we had to dig new wells for a week. Then we had millions of frogs, which caused that awful smell when they died. Well," said Pharaoh, "all these so-called miracles you lot have been able to do. Now Moses tells me we are to have gnats and flies. Can you match that too?" The magicians looked at each other and were silent. "And there's something else," said Pharaoh. "Moses said that the province of Goshen, where the Jews live, won't be affected. He said that this God of his will make what he called a division. Anybody want to say anything?" The head magician stepped forward and said, "None of this is possible, or we could do it." Then there was a great buzzing and humming, and everyone was madly scratching and swatting. Pharaoh checked up on the division. It was true. No insects in Goshen. He sent for Moses and agreed to everything. The gnats and flies vanished. Then Pharaoh went back on his word and kept on breaking his promises. God made the plagues worse and worse, and each time Pharaoh said the people could go, and then when God stopped the plague, he said they couldn't. He must have been mad. Well, he was, of course. He brought down terrible things on his people. Their cattle died. They were infected with awful sores. Their crops were destroyed by great electrical storms and hailstones as big as fists, and nothing could be salvaged, because then millions of locusts came and ate everything up. Then when the locusts passed, a terrible black fog came, and nobody could see anyone else, and the people just sat in misery for 3 days. Pharaoh was now on his own. Everyone told him to let the slaves go, to do as Moses asked. "If their God can do these things," they said, then get rid of them. Every day reports came into Pharaoh about the division. All said the same. In Goshen, where the Hebrews lived, there had been no black fog, no locusts, no lightning and hail, no sores, no cattle death, nothing. Other reports told of how Moses was feared now by the Egyptians even more than they feared Pharaoh. When the darkness went away, Moses again went to Pharaoh, and again Pharaoh went back on his word. The two men looked at each other. Pharaoh's eyes were full of hate. Moses felt sad. He had just received his orders from God regarding the next and final plague. Moses held up his hand. "I have to tell you," he said, "that in 10 days' time, at midnight, all the firstborn in Egypt will die. The firstborn of every single family, yours too. Whether or not you will let the slaves go is now out of your hands. They leave the next morning." Then Moses left the great palace and called together the elders and leaders of the Hebrews. "Now then," said Moses, "we all have our orders too. Every family is to prepare the same meal that night, roast lamb. When the lamb is killed, some of its blood is to be daubed on the lintel and doorposts of every Hebrew house, so that when the angels of death pass through Egypt that night, they will see the blood and pass over those houses. And this deliverance," said Moses, is to be celebrated every year from now on forever, and will be called the Passover. Tell the people that the meal will be eaten to the last bit. Everyone is to be dressed, ready to leave at short notice. And at midnight, on the 10th night, to every Egyptian family came a death, and to every Hebrew slave came freedom. The children of Israel just left. No one stopped or hindered them in any way. Soon it all seemed like a bad dream. All the years of slavery, the cruelty, the hopelessness, they were on their way. They sang, they danced, they laughed. They were full of trust and hope and joy. It didn't last long. As soon as the first sign of a setback occurred, they grew frightened and started to complain. First it was the route, not north, the most direct way to Canaan, but south, and then east into rather bare, unfriendly country. Then it was the food, and then the lack of water. The miracle of the deliverance was soon forgotten. And mind you, pretty soon they had something really worth worrying about. Pharaoh, who, when he rose from weeping over his own dead firstborn son, decided to get nasty. So he called out his thousands of chariots and soldiers, and he went after the children of Israel. They'd reached the shores of the Red Sea, and now there was water in front of them, and behind them, coming up fast, the chariots full of armed men. They were full of panic. God told Moses what to do, and he did it. He waved his staff over the sea, and the sea parted, and the people walked on dry land on the bottom of the sea. On either side of them were great walls of water held up by God. Ahead of them, to comfort them, was a huge glowing cloud set there by God. When they were halfway across, the Egyptians reached the shore and went straight on down after them. God waited until every chariot and soldier was below land level, and then let down the walls of water and drowned the lot of them. Ahead, unharmed, walked the children of Israel, saved by a great miracle. But in less than a week they were complaining again. The water where they'd camped was undrinkable, they said. The walking was hard on the feet. And maybe, they said, we would have been better off back in Egypt. And Moses stood for quite a lot of this nonsense and then had a word with God. Well, God fixed the water right away. He showed Moses a certain tree near the oasis and told him to throw it in. Moses did so, and the water became sweet, and the people cheered up. Moses didn't hurry them. They were city dwellers after all, slaves or not, and this desert journey was going to be tough. After a week or two, they went on, and the complaints soon began again. They now remembered, it seemed, only the good things of Egypt, the oven-baked bread, the plentiful meat and fish, very rose-colored glasses. By the time they'd been 6 weeks out of slavery, they were holding anti-Moses meetings. True enough, they were all very hungry. The food they'd brought had finished, and the country was bare. Then God sent for Moses. Tell the people, he said, that there will be poultry for supper and fresh cereal for breakfast. The cereal will have to be gathered from the ground before sun-up, so get everyone up early. Moses, who had perfect faith, told the people. Everybody waited to see what poultry for supper meant. The hot sun burned down. Lunchtime came and went. Thousands of hungry people. Then as the sun began to go down, the supper flew in. A great flock of quail delivered themselves straight into the camp. There was plenty for everyone, and the people ate well and thanked Moses. He wasn't too impressed with their full tummy happiness and told them all to go to bed early. Next morning, just as it got light, he got them all up again to gather their breakfast. As the light increased and the dew lifted, the people at first could see nothing. But then they saw that the ground was covered with what looked like fine frosted corn flakes. A child bent down and tasted it and said it was like honey, but crisp. The people began to gather it, saying to each other, "What is it?" And that became its name. What is it? Or as they said it, in Hebrew, manna. And every morning the manna was there. It didn't keep, but it was there, fresh every morning. Every man gathered his own, and everyone had to get up early before the sun got at it. Moses looked at the people bent to their task the next morning and thought, early rising, exercise for the back, and a balanced diet. God must be toning them up for something. Well, God was, but not right away. The days turned into weeks, and the people and their problems kept Moses very busy. He began to look pretty tired, and felt it too. But one evening, he had a guest to cheer him up a bit, his father-in-law, Jethro. Moses was fond of him and respected the wisdom of the wise old priest. Jethro looked at Moses with no less affection and began to speak. "You're doing too much," he said. "The people must start to govern themselves. You've done all you promised. You freed them from their slavery in Egypt. You brought them safely across the Red Sea and drowned all their enemies. I wish I'd been there to see it. You arranged the daily arrival of manna from heaven for them, and you found a way of making fresh water by banging on a rock with your stick. You've even won a battle with the Amalekites for them." "Not me," said Moses. "Not me. God." "They can't see God," said Jethro. "They can see you. You're easier to complain to than God. You're nearer." "Yes," said Jethro, you're doing too much. It's ridiculous that you should have to listen to every grievance and dispute and spend hours and hours on trivialities. Now, Moses, here's what you have to do. You are to appoint leaders, honest men who will do all this work for you. You will deal only with great matters. No one but you can talk to God, and God is entitled to an uncluttered mind in his head man." Moses listened to all this and acted upon it. And indeed, the people became better organized. And Moses led them on the next part of the journey, to the great plain at the foot of Mount Sinai. At this place, God told him, "Through your mouth, I will start to make these children of my beloved Israel into a special people." Moses told the people to pray and prepare themselves for 2 days. Everyone was to be ready on the plain below the mountain on the morning of the 3rd day. Everyone was, and it was something to see. First, a sort of hush, and then great thunderings and lightnings came from the mountain. Then the sound of 1,000,000 trumpets began, and went on, louder and louder, till the people thought their heads would burst. And then, suddenly, it was quiet and still, and Moses began the lessons from God. First came the 10 great rules of behavior, and after these commandments began the lesser rules in great detail. The people were dazed and frightened. So God asked Moses to go up to the top of the mountain where they could talk quietly together, and Moses could collect all the other rules and laws. It took a long time. Moses was up there nearly 7 weeks. He was permitted to take all the notes he needed, but God insisted upon writing the first 10 commandments himself, with his finger, on 2 tablets of stone. When it was time to go, Moses turned to God and said, "You are angry, Lord. Why?" And God said, "The people have already disobeyed me. They've broken their promises and are down there worshipping an idol." "An idol?" said Moses. "Yes," said God. "They've put together all their bits of gold and have made an animal idol, a calf, and they are offering sacrifices to it." "Well," said God, "that's enough. I'm going to wipe them out." Moses was afraid, but spoke. "They broke their promise to you, Lord," he said, "because they are human and fools. How can you break your promise to them? You are God." And God calmed down, and Moses left him. But Moses was no God, and by the time he reached the foot of the mountain and saw the golden calf, he was in a flaming temper. The drunken, dancing, singing people looked up, and there stood Moses